morning, everyone. It is a pleasure seeing you all and welcome to the IDEA Academy. As you know, we are currently at the pinnacle of the Academy and getting into the month of May. The Academy is up until the 24th of June. You can still register or have some friend registered. All these sessions are absolutely tremendous. And this session alone, I guess, is worth your money. To those who wouldn't know the Academy in a nutshell, you will be able to enjoy 90-minute sessions until the 24th of June, around 15 commissions, and you will develop your professional skills development, low practice areas, showcase days, and of course, a lot of networking. And don't forget that you can invite your young associates for the price of 50 euros, which is the cheapest you will ever get, I guess, for 3 full months of content. With regards to the schedule overview for May, you will see that we have nice sessions coming on. Today, obviously, the challenges of gig workers on the 18th of May, minority shareholders controlled by legal and other means on the 20th of May, on the 25th of May, crypto assets, what's next, and a showcase day on the 25th, and on the 27th, a networking Visio Escape that you should all attend. It's going to be pretty fun, I can assure you that. I really want to thank our sponsors. We wouldn't be there without them. That is STP, the legal tech company, our platinum sponsors, and silver sponsor GSK Stockman, and bronze sponsor Bormanian. Thank you so much, guys. We appreciate. And I obviously, of course, want to thank our SCILL Commission officers, Friederike Henke, Marco Gardino, and Max Maillet. They are bringing tremendous speakers, and I really can't thank them enough. And up next, I want to, of course, thank Daniel Kidd, who will explain to us how to navigate rankings and prepare for submission, all the practical instructions. So I am looking forward to see next year who we have listened to Daniel well, and will be ranked on the LinkedIn. Enjoy every second of it. You can also get the next meetings of our SCILL programs on the 8th of June will be about electronic signatures and digitalization of commercial agreements. On the 22nd of June, we will get a keynote about your personal brand. And on the 22nd of June, we will also get a LinkedIn presence boost in cooperation with Dentons. So make sure you also log in for these wonderful meetings. And without further ado, I will leave the floor to Marco.
Thank you very much, Francois, and thank you all for attending. Today we have a very, I hope, interesting webinar, and the topic, as you know, will be legal rankings. Legal rankings, I think, it is often a debated topic. It happened to me last week that I discovered to be ranked in a ranking I didn't know it was existing. And then I saw also other firms posting on LinkedIn the fact that there was this ranking and the fact that their lawyers were ranked, and actually didn't make a submission. So I was guessing whether this ranking was worth. And the other thing which happened to me was a month ago, I had to prepare, I had to support the marketing department of my firm in the preparation of Chambers corporate and M&A submission, and it was a nightmare. So I realized that, I mean, help from people who really know the matter is very important. And this is the topic we actually have been talking about with the SCILL Commission over the past month, actually. So I'm very happy to have Daniel here, which I immediately introduced to you. So Daniel is a director at Kidd Aitken, which is a company specialized in legal marketing. And Daniel is the perfect person for this kind of topic because he has a 12 years experience, spent 4 years spent in Chambers in London, where he was editor of the first 3 editions of Chamber Asia Pacific, and where he launched also the first edition in Singapore in 2008. Then he was responsible for a ranking table in the directory, reviewing submissions, coordinating the work of a team of 15 researchers, and he also contributed to the company's European, US, and global directories. Then in 2010, he left Chambers and he set up his own legal marketing consultancy, which is called, as I was saying, Kid Consulting Limited. And he currently assists local and international law firms with legal directory rankings and other marketing and communication activities. So I think he's the perfect person, especially because of his, his wide view concerning the topic of legal directories. And I would leave the floor to Daniel, asking him the first question of this webinar, which is, as I was saying, the number of legal directories is proliferating. So we have so let's say institutional legal directories such as Legal 500, Chambers, who is with Legal, International Financial Law Review. So with reference to these directories, what are the main differences? What, in your opinion, is the most interesting one? Whether there is a more reputable or less reputable one? So a brief overview of legal directories. Just a practical indication for all the attendees. If you have questions, please do not hesitate to make them. You can either intervene in person, or if you prefer to leave a message, I will obviously transfer the question to Daniel. We will stop at the end of each block for questions, and then we will have a longer session for questions at the end of the webinar. So please feel free to make questions. Daniel is here to reply, and I think it's a very unique opportunity for you to learn more about these interesting subjects. Daniel, to you.
Thanks very much, Marco. And thanks everyone for having me. Great to be here. Really looking forward to exploring some of these issues with you over the next hour or so. This is always tends to be quite a lively and sometimes divisive topic, because we all know that legal directories are a kind of necessary evil in a way. I think nobody particularly enjoys participating in the process. It can be quite time consuming. It can be quite stressful. It also involves using a certain amount of political capital sometimes at your firm to get into the submissions, to get onto the radar. Some directories take a frustrating amount of time to recognize you. So there are lots of challenges, I think, with participating in the directories, but there are obvious rewards as well to getting ranked, especially in the most prestigious directories. Now, there are obviously a lot of directories and even more awards organizations out there. And to Marco's question, some are definitely more worthwhile and more reputable than others. And we can discuss that in a bit more detail as we go through today's presentation. But I do think that the key difference, to my mind, to answer your question directly, Marco, is the more prestigious directories and the better researched ones actually tend to be the most difficult to get into. I think that that's probably the way it should be, really, but it also means that they are the most labor intensive in terms of actually participating and what you need to do on the submissions, what you need to do with your clients, what you need to do in every step of the process to actually get on the radar. And so, I think what I'd say is that if you are going to take the time and make the effort to participate in the most prestigious directories, then let's do it in the best possible way, in a most effective way. So let's not waste our time, but let's actually do it in a focused and an effective way. And that's hopefully what I'll try and describe to you today. So I'll be going through the various different stages of the directory process. And as Marco says, I'll be pausing at the end of each section. If you do have questions, very happy to answer them as we go along. But also hope we can have a really interesting discussion at the end once I've kind of run through my points as well. But first, I just wanted to open up with a bit of a poll. I had a handful of questions for you about your experience with the directories. If you could just have a look at those. Okay, so that's interesting. Particularly happy to see that you think that the directories are important to your career. I guess that's why you're attending this session in the first place. So that's encouraging. And good to see the majority of you have participated in a legal directory submission before, and that's great. Hopefully, for those of you that haven't done so, today will give you an indication of the basics, and for those that have, hopefully today will hone your skills when you are participating in the process. So I will get started and share my screen. Okay. So essentially today we're talking about best practice for managing the submission process and improving rankings. And I'm going to try and look at this through the perspective of younger lawyers and the challenges that you face in participating in your firm's submissions. So before we actually get stuck into the submissions themselves, we have to actually understand the various components of the submission process, I think. And those, to my mind, that are the strategy. So before you get started, which directories, which awards are you focused on? What's important to you? What's not? There are far too many out there to kind of focus on everything. So you need to make some really clear decisions on what you're investing your time and your political capital at the firm in. Once you've decided on the directories, then you need to really, have a plan to interact with the various components of that directories ranking process. And most of the reputable directories out there tend to focus, by and large, on three things. And obviously, you need to prepare for those three things in advance. Those three things are persuasive submissions. So, that's the bulk of the work here, right? Getting a written submission into the directory that showcases your work, that showcases your practice's work, and the matters that you've handled during the research period. Second, client referees. Again, the most reputable, best researched directories have a strong focus on the quality and volume of the feedback that you get from your clients. And that is absolutely vital to ranking outcomes, particularly at individual level. And, if I were to draw a hierarchy of the directories, I would suggest that Chambers would be at the top, both in terms of the rigor of its research process, the time investment it takes to get ranked in Chambers, but also, interestingly, the focus on client referees. And so we really need to drill down into some detail on that, I think, because it does take a lot to get ranked in Chambers, and client referee feedback is key to getting ranked. And finally, the importance of peer feedback. Peer feedback essentially being what other lawyers in your market say about you, to that directory researcher. Now, this is obviously more difficult for us to control, but it nevertheless is key to getting you on the radar, especially again as a younger lawyer, for those up and coming categories. And that's about profile building, that's about general marketing initiatives, networking, getting your name out there to both peers and third parties so that you are recognized when the directories are speaking to other firms about your market. So we're going to go through each of these steps in the next hour or so and discuss some of these issues in more detail. So if we start with your strategy then, which directory should you focus on? As I said, there are hundreds of directories out there, even more awards, ranging from a Chambers and Partners and a Legal 500, which have permanent research teams of 100, 200 people researching legal markets all over the world from a central base in London, all the way down to, frankly, some guy in his bedroom firing out emails to any firm that he can find saying that they've won the award and will you please pay £5,000 for a nice plaque and a trophy. That really is the range of kind of options out there. I would suggest that you need to focus on those directories that make sense, firstly for your practice or your industry sector focus, and more importantly, the directories that actually have a kind of reputation and a standing and are going to be useful in your kind of marketing materials and useful for your professional development and ultimately for your career. Which directories are those? Well, I think you can break them down into two buckets, really. You have the sort of full service directories that cover a wide range of practice areas, Chambers and Legal 500 definitely being the two most prestigious of those. Both Chambers and Legal 500 rank younger lawyers. They rank young partners as up-and-comers for Chambers and next-generation partners for Legal 500. They rank young counsel and senior associates as associates to watch in Chambers and rising stars in Legal 500. So there are specific categories in both of those directories for young lawyers. I know, especially from the past couple of years, that those directories are becoming increasingly willing to rank younger lawyers, and also increasingly willing to rank diverse lawyers. Chambers, in particular, has come under a lot of criticism recently for its lack of diversity, for having a lot of old, white, grey-haired men at the top of its table for a very long time. And we've definitely seen that in the past couple of years, a lot of younger lawyers are getting ranked, at the kind of up-and-comer bottom end of those tables, and a lot of diverse lawyers, whether they be female, whether it be ethnically diverse lawyers, are getting ranked for the first time. And I do think that there is an opportunity there, more so than before, to get your foot in the door of those two prestigious directories. There are also, I guess, the next tier down of full service directories like IFLR 1000, which is obviously focuses on corporate and finance work specifically, which has a certain following in certain parts of the world, less so in others. Nevertheless, most of the firms that we work with do submit to IFLR 1000 alongside Chambers and Legal 500. And again, that's still based on submissions, client feedback, peer feedback. Then I think you have another layer down of directories that are almost solely based on peer feedback and peer referrals, and those are the likes of Who's Who Legal, likes of Best Lawyers, for example, which is obviously a predominantly US-based directory, but which does rank lawyers in other regions, and other directories that really are frankly less reputable, less involved, and really do rely very heavily on peer feedback and not much else. And then there are, on the other hand, the more practice area and industry specific directories. You have a whole raft of directories for IP lawyers out there: World Trademark Review, IAM Patent, Managing IP Stars, all of which are, you know, pretty useful, I think, for an IP lawyer. You have directories specific to competition, Global Competition Review, that has a 40 under 40 section for young lawyers, again, very well regarded for competition specifically. Global Arbitration Review, Global Investigations Review, all sorts of practice area and industry specific directories. And I think that, you know, if they are a good fit for your practice, and they are definitely worth considering. The one sort of caveat I'd say to all this is, don't spread yourself too thin across too many directories. And the reason I say that is not so much the work it involves, because once you've done one submission, frankly, it's pretty straightforward to flip it into the format of another directory. It's more the focus, it's more the pressure that you're going to put on your clients, particularly because all of the directories that I've just mentioned, apart from the peer review ones, ask for client referees. And, you know, they are obviously researched at different points during the year. But if you are going to be submitting to 5 or 6 directories, you need to potentially ask your same clients to respond to 5 or 6 surveys. And that is probably not going to endear very much to your clients at the end of the year once they've gone through that process 5 or 6 times. And so I think that you need to pick your battles, and you need to make a decision based on your practice, based on what you want to achieve, which you're going to, you know, which you're going to really focus on. Once you've focused on the directories, I think you need to have a really clear view of how important individual rankings are for overall firm rankings. And I think that this is really key in directories like Chambers, where there is a really strong correlation between your individual, the number and level of individual rankings a firm has, and its overall firm ranking. And the reason I mentioned this is because I think that as younger up-and-comer lawyers, this is a really helpful argument that you can actually make to whoever's running your submissions, your heads of department, in order to get you on the radar. The more individuals that the firm has ranked, the better its ranking chances overall. And so I think that when you're trying to get onto the submission, you know, trying to get some space on the submission, you know, this is a really key argument that you can make to your practice group leaders. You know, let's try and get me ranked. That's obviously good for me. That's also good for the firm. And again, you know, that's a key consideration when you are, you know, preparing your strategy for the submission. How many lawyers should a firm be pitching, and how do young lawyers fit into that pitch? And I think that obviously this question is going to be different depending on the size of your firm, depending on the size of your practice group, but you ideally want to kind of focus on a fairly small range of lawyers on the submission and back those lawyers with lead roles on a number of matters, and back those lawyers with a number of client referees who are able to speak about them specifically. And so you need to, before you get started on the submission, you need to think about, you know, who in your practice group is really being pitched for new or improved rankings, and tailor the matters that you include and the client referees that you include to that pitch. And again, this is an opportunity, I think, for younger lawyers to sort of get on the radar and get space on the submissions. It's not an easy or quick process, right? It takes time, especially for the more established directories like Chambers and Legal 500. It takes time to get ranked. It takes time to get on the radar in the first instance, and it takes even more time to get ranked. And so I think it's really important to set short, medium, and long-term targets. You know, what are you trying to achieve? If you've never appeared on a submission before, it is frankly extremely unlikely that you're going to get ranked the first time that you do. And the short-term target should frankly be to get on the radar, to get into the researcher's mind, to try and you know, get some build some profile on the submission, so that when next year comes around, you are already on the radar at the directory. You've got some credit in the bank, and you know, you have a better chance of actually kind of making the leap into the ranking table. Your midterm and long-term targets, I think, are getting onto the ranking table and then slowly working your way up. As younger lawyers, the kind of up-and-comer category is 9 times out of 10 the category that you are going to end up in if you get ranked. And then it's a case of building your way up. So your strategy is important because it's really about making sure you have a consistent approach to your submissions. And again, this is something that, you know, I think it's important to communicate to the people who are in charge of your submissions. There is no point chopping and changing your approach year on year. You need to back a certain number of people per submission, and keep backing those people year on year in recognition of the fact that the directory's research is cumulative, and it does take time to build up the credit in the bank that you need to get ranked. So that hopefully gives you a broad sense of some considerations before you actually throw yourself into the submission process. Just want to pause there, see if anybody's got any questions before we move on to some more practical steps as to how you prepare for submissions and then how you actually, you know, write them and get the best results out of them.
I see two. Okay, I will make the first question, which is, it may happen, obviously there might be firms who are very focused on directories as an important tool for their marketing. On the opposite, it may happen that there are firms whereby basically there is no culture on legal directories. So how would you convince the marketing department of such firms to invest on preparing legal directories, given that, as you were indicating, it requires lots of time, lots of dedication, both by marketing guys as well as the lawyers involved?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think that the directories, for all their faults and for all the effort that it takes, they are still, you know, the best third-party endorsement of a firm's work and an individual lawyer's work. There's not much that compares to a Chambers ranking, frankly, in terms of the marketing kind of capital that provides you, as long as it's used properly in your marketing communications strategy. Obviously, you know, you're not going to get much by getting a ranking in Chambers and kind of letting it sit there and hoping that clients are going to find you in that directory. You need to obviously publicize it. It needs to be, you need to do things on your website. You need to do things in your email signatures. You need to, do things in your, kind of social media to publicize that achievement. But it is, I think, as lawyers, that there are not many opportunities like a prestigious legal directory ranking to really kind of have third-party validation of your practice. And I think that is key. another thing to bear in mind is that ultimately this is a process that does not have a direct cost involved. So, you do not have to, most prestigious directories are not pay for play. The firm does not have to take out advertising in Chambers or Legal 500, for example, to get ranked. The firm does not have to pay to submit. There is obviously a time cost involved, but there is no direct cost to marketing budgets to participating in directories. And third, I'm biased because I do this for a living, but I do think that directory rankings are important. And at Kid Aitken, we work with over 160 law firms in every region of the world, and we have countless examples of, anecdotal examples, but examples nevertheless, of firms that, will forward us on emails from clients saying, that we have, part of the reason that we instructed you was because you were ranked in the top 2 tiers of Chambers for this practice area. We know of certain jurisdictions that will not instruct a firm for a certain type of work unless they are ranked in Chambers or Legal 500. Now, that's not the case everywhere, but it is certainly the case in certain jurisdictions. I think the other argument you can make is that having rankings, improving rankings is not just a helpful tool to attract clients and work, but it's a really helpful tool for attracting talent to your law firm and for internal sort of maintenance of that talent as well. Getting high rankings, improving rankings, getting new people ranked is great for morale of firms, and it's great for it's great for talent retention for that reason. But I also know for a fact that law students refer to the directories a lot when they are considering what firms to join as trainees. And I think a lot of firms, even the very, very, very big firms in London, in other parts of the world, place a lot of importance in the directories for that reason, almost more than anything else now, because of that talent retention and talent attraction angle.
Thank you, Daniel. This was very interesting. And before moving on to the other topic, there's a question. So what if your firm is ranked in a directory for a consecutive few years and then disappears 1 year? How to regain the trust and attention of the researchers?
Yeah, I mean, that can happen. And it is generally speaking, it's harder to fall out of the rankings than it is to get into them in the first place. And so the first thing you need to do in that situation is to understand why you've dropped out of the rankings. My feeling is 9 times out of 10, it's because you've had at least consecutive years of low levels of feedback from clients and low levels of feedback from peers. That tends to be the reason why a firm drops out, unless there have been like a whole series of departures at partner level for that practice group. That can be another reason. But you're right, obviously you need to get back on the radar. You need to win back the trust of the researcher. And part of that is just refreshing your strategy and refreshing your processes. Part of that is just doing what you need to do, and that is getting high rates of client feedback to convince the researcher that you're still held in high esteem by your clients, and even more importantly, sometimes than that, mobilizing some of your contacts in the legal market generally to support you with peer feedback. Because when a firm drops out of the table, if we can get people at other law firms questioning that decision, you can get back on the radar pretty quickly. And we can go on to talk about peer feedback and strategies around that a bit later. Yeah. But it's really about getting back on the radar. Is really about the feedback elements of this process, and that's getting clients to respond and getting peers to support you.
Thank you, Daniel. So if there are no questions for the time being, I would move on to the next topic. So more practical indications on how to prepare a submission. And I would like to share with you, if I manage to, okay, hopefully, Daniel, you can confirm that.
Yep.
Maybe you, okay, perfect. Okay, so here is a submission form for chambers. In particular, here we have a submission form for the compliance in EMEA region, which, by the way, the submission time will expire 19th of May. I have this form because my firm is preparing submission for chambers for compliance. But I mean, this is pretty similar to all other forms of chambers. I mean, as far as those I had the possibility to see. So the document is pretty impressive. I mean, even without putting contents in, it's a sort of 20 pages document, which obviously needs to be filled out with name of lawyers, the indications of the main clients, then a description of each activity. Then it comes another part with the, if I remember well, there is a part on the, here it is, with the confidential information. So what I should consider confidential, what not. Should I be prejudiced in case I put everything in confidential and I cannot put anything visible to third parties? And then obviously there is a huge spreadsheet with all the contacts. So when I saw the first time these submission forms, I felt a bit lost. So I think that Daniel can give us some indications on how to move around these submission forms, which, I mean, they request lots of information, but what's the right information I should give? How I should organize the information? Where I should focus on?
Yeah, thanks, Marco. So I think that you're right. These documents are a bit overwhelming, especially when you're faced with a blank version of it, and you've got lots of information potentially to fill in. I think, and I'll go on to talk about this in more detail, but I think you have to just focus on what the key elements of that document are, and what the researcher is actually really going to be interested in reading. And the most important parts of this are your pitch at firm and individual level. So why should I be ranked as an individual? Why should my firm be ranked as a firm? And then the supporting kind of work highlights that back up that pitch. And we'll talk a bit about how to prepare those in a minute. For the client referees, obviously, you need to give contact details and fill in that spreadsheet, which is a bit less complicated than it looks. But yeah, you need to have a clear strategy behind client referees as well. So let me share my screen again. So how to prepare. Obviously, before you actually get stuck into the submission itself, you need to, I think, have a process of, have an ongoing process throughout the year to help you prepare your submission materials and help lay the ground for a successful submission when it comes around. So, keeping track of your representative matters. You tend to have sort of one deadline each year to submit your form, at least to chambers. The other submissions for Legal 500 and any other directory that you submit for will follow from that. And what you don't want to do is to get to a situation 2 weeks before the chambers deadline where you're scrambling around to try and write up your matters from scratch. You don't have anything saved. You've got all sorts of other competing pieces of work happening for clients, and you're not able to devote as much time as you would like to the directories process. And I think that's really key. It's a key part of the planning here. Plan ahead, keep track of your matters as they happen. If you're a transactional lawyer, obviously that that tends to happen automatically at firms. If you're in other areas, I think it's really important just to keep short, punchy summaries of the work that you've done. And small things, keep records of closing dates, for example, to save you having to go back through your files to find, when the matter that you handled actually closed, because all the directories will need a closing date for any matter that you submit. Keep a record of the client and their contact details that were associated with the matter. Again, small thing, but just it helps you not have to go back through your records once submission season comes around to find that information. And so keeping a kind of running record of matters you've handled over a year. Those descriptions only need to be, 1 or 2 sentences, but it just helps organize your thoughts when the submission season comes around. Fostering key client relationships is obviously key, because you are going to be relying on those clients as referees when the directory season comes around. You need their positive feedback. You need them to be responsive. You need them to frankly do you a favor by taking 10 or 15 minutes out of their busy day to respond to a directory survey. And so by maintaining strong client relationships, by kind of laying the groundwork for them being client referees in the first place, means that you're not scrambling around 2 weeks before the deadline trying to work out who you're going to put forward as your referees for that submission. Building a professional reputation with peers and third parties is absolutely vital to getting recognition, particularly as a young lawyer. I can't stress how important this is. Frankly, even with the most reputable directories, you can put forward a great submission. You can have some nice client feedback. If nobody in your market recognizes you as a leading lawyer, you may well not get into the table. And so that kind of professional networking is really key, so that when one of your peers gets asked about you at interview, or gets asked more generally about which kind of young lawyers they've seen in the market generally, your name comes up. Because if it doesn't, and the directory researchers might ask specifically about you, you need to do whatever you can to ensure that your name is likely to come up in discussions about the legal market in which you practice. And that shows the importance of networking and profile building in general. People who appear at conferences, people who get involved in kind of seminars, people who are active in social media. All of those things that are obviously important for general profile building, for building your brand, building your professional network generally, are also really important for the directories, because that peer feedback element of this process is really key, especially if you are an unranked lawyer. To get on the radar, you need a bit of recognition from peers. And so that does not happen overnight, and that needs to be part of your sort of ongoing efforts to build your profile generally.
Daniel, just one question. What are the peers you suggest to focus on? So are you referring to peers who are already ranked in the directories, or it can be anyone you meet during your transactions? Or obviously I do corporate M&A, but those who do, for instance, compliance, so that's not transaction, but that's in their day-to-day activities. So who are the peers we should focus on?
So by and large, it's people who are likely to be interviewed about their own practices by the directories. As part of that interview, the Chambers or Legal 500 researcher will ask that partner to provide feedback on other lawyers. And so it's difficult to be too precise, because you obviously don't know who other firms are putting forward at interview about their own submissions. But we do know that the trend is for the directories to proactively invite younger lawyers, diverse lawyers to those calls now. So it's not just the old grey-haired practice heads who are going to be interviewed at other firms. It can be younger lawyers, it can be emerging lawyers. And so I think that that's kind of one thing to bear in mind. The other thing to bear in mind is that you can actually put peers forward as referees for the directories as well. So you have what is called a client referee list, but that list can be populated by lawyers at other law firms. And again, that's where, to get on the radar, you might consider putting forward some people at other law firms who know the market well and who can provide some comparative feedback on you in comparison to other kind of younger lawyers that they know. So it's not an easy process to target really specifically, but it's important to be visible, to be out there, to be on the tip of people's tongues. So.
Very interesting, and I think this replies Laura's question in this regard. And I have one more question to then follow on with the next topics, which is one part of the submission when I prepare the one for my firm was whether the matter had also press coverage. So the question is how and whether it is important to take care of press coverage of the activity we do. So whether it is good to push for instance, transactions to go public in order then to be considered more reliable for rankings, or obviously I am talking about press coverage of the sector. So as you know, at the moment there are many online newspapers and so on dedicated to lawyers, which basically publish what law firms write. So what's the importance and the relationship of legal marketing and press coverage in the respective directories?
So I think that on the submission, the press coverage is really there just to give the researcher a sense that the matter you've put forward is of some significance, right? So if you have a publishable matter, so obviously confidential matters are slightly different. If you have a confidential matter with no press coverage, that's not a bad reflection on that matter. It's just a reflection that that matter is probably confidential and it's not in the public domain, and that's absolutely fine. If you have a publishable matter, it's helpful to include some press coverage that's related to that matter, just to show that it is just to give the directories a way of, as you say, validating that what you say about that matter is correct. But more importantly, especially if the press coverage is in the mainstream media, it gives the researcher a sense that, okay, this is actually an interesting trend that the firm is interacting with. And I think that that's a broader point to bear in mind when you're preparing your submissions, right? Who is the audience of this submission? It tends to be a directory researcher sitting in London in most cases. They are not necessarily going to be experts in your local market or in your local industry sector. And a client name or matter that kind of resonates with you as being obviously significant in your jurisdiction or your industry is not going to necessarily resonate with the researcher in the same way. And so part of the challenge here is to hold the researcher's hand through your matters and through your clients a bit and say, well, look, this client's actually a really big deal for these reasons in this jurisdiction or in this industry sector that I'm involved in, or this is a current trend. And as you can see from the press coverage of this matter, it's kind of made in mainstream media here. It's really important. That sort of stuff, you know, I think we just shouldn't assume that the directory researcher is going to do loads of Googling around the matters and the client names that you provide. We should be doing that job for them. We should be holding their hands through the importance of the clients and the matters that you're putting on the submission. And press coverage is definitely one way of doing that.
And then we have another couple of questions which are super interesting, so I will make them immediately. One, I think is interesting, especially for AIJA audience, which again has to do with peers and whether it is useful to insert in the peers also foreign lawyers, or whether it is better to focus on lawyers of the same jurisdiction of the person making the submission.
So I think it's I think it depends a little bit on the nature of the firm that you're at. If you work at an independent local firm, then I would suggest that getting some recognition from maybe international lawyers who are familiar with your jurisdiction and are familiar with a range of kind of independent local firms in your jurisdiction and can provide comparative feedback on those firms. I think that is really helpful feedback, both for your firm and for your kind of individual ranking chances. I think you can put lawyers down from your own jurisdiction. I think you've got to be really confident that they're going to help you out, for sure. But I think the question is probably less whether they are based in your jurisdiction or whether they're based abroad, and more, are they going to be able to provide a level of comparative feedback that places you amongst other lawyers and talks about you in favorable terms in comparison to them.
Yeah, so which means knowledge of the market as well as knowledge of the subject matter, as well as the fact that probably they cannot be just peers who you know, but who should have worked with you on some activities, because otherwise.
Yeah, it's not particularly helpful that you just got a lawyer who just happens to have worked with one firm in your jurisdiction on one deal and they had a good experience. I mean, that's fine. It's not unhelpful feedback, but it's not gonna change the world in terms of the researcher's understanding of your practice.
I would take the last question for this part, and then I ask pardon to Thomas Rieber. I will postpone his question to the next topic, as I think it concerns more the involvement of young lawyers in the participation to directories. And the last question from Thomas, I hope to pronounce it correctly, Krivansky. So, and this is an interesting one, because also for corporate things, it may happen that, I mean, we do a lot of day-to-day assistance, which may have to do with obviously also difficult legal problems or solving peculiar situations, but obviously they are not transactions, so they do not go out on the press. So the question is how to attract researchers when it is not a deal to be involved, but rather a day-to-day consultancy or advisory activity.
Yeah, I think you have to. I think it's important to understand what type of work the researcher is going to give most credit for each different practice area, right? And so for a corporate M&A submission, I mean, frankly, transactional work is given more credit than sort of ongoing corporate advisory work, for example. Unfortunately, for those of you who do a lot of that corporate advisory work, that is the reality. And so your first challenge, if you're doing a lot of that work, is to try and get it onto the submission in the first place, because one-off deals are going to be prioritized, frankly, of that type of work. If you are including sort of ongoing advisory work, and obviously that that can be more relevant to other practices and other industry sectors. For example, for a compliance submission, by kind of definition, the majority of that work is going to be ongoing advisory work. If you are including it, then I think you want to do two things. You want to give some overall context as to the scope of your advisory role for that client generally, but then you want to make sure that you give some specifics about issues that you've actually handled in the 12-month period under review, because it's always worth bearing in mind that all the directories are basically looking at the past 12 months in their research, and so you need some specifics that say, in the past 12 months, we have advised the client on this issue, this issue, this issue, and more importantly, and we'll talk about this a little bit later in terms of work highlights, what was particularly, pick out one issue from the past 12 months that was particularly important to the client, particularly complex, your advice was particularly sophisticated, it was a particularly important piece of standalone advisory work that you handled. It's not particularly helpful just to say, we advise X client on a day-to-day basis on a range of corporate and compliance matters. That's not going to move a needle at all. If you can pull out some of those matters and maybe focus on one of them as a particularly interesting example from the past 12 months, that's going to be more effective.
Okay, and just one last question is very short. Is there a magic number of referees and peers, which is, let me say, the minimum number of people who should speak for us? Or, it can be one, but very important.
So on the clients, on the referees, some directories have limits to the total number of clients you can put forward. So Chambers is 20 for the practice area as a whole. Some directories don't have limits. So Legal 500, there is no limit to the number of referees you can put forward per practice area. I would say that in order to have a chance of either getting into a table for the first time or start getting promoted in existing ranking, you need to put forward ideally at least 5 client referees on the referee list for each submission that you're contributing to. A good response rate, frankly, for directories is about 50%. And it's quite unusual for firms or individuals to get a 100% response rate of all their clients getting back to the directories. Emails go to spam folders, clients get busy, it's not a priority, all sorts of things happen, right? So getting 2 or 3 responses from your clients as an individual is actually a good result. Obviously, those responses need to be high quality and quite detailed and positive. But in terms of volume, 2 or 3 is a good result. In order to get 2 or 3, I'd suggest getting 5 client referees on the list. It's kind of a minimum. For peers, if you can get recognition from 1 or 2 people, then that's great. You don't need the entire legal market to be, sort of talking about you. You just need to. It's about giving the researcher the confidence that you do have a name, right? That you are known, that you are doing good work, and that can come from 1 or 2 people maximum.
Okay, and I will pick up again the questions made at the end of the webinar, just not to be sure not to run out of time, and I will follow on with the next topic of our discussion, which I think is one of the most interesting one, which concerns young lawyers. So obviously there are many differences in firms. There are big law firms, there are small law firms, there are single professions law firms, and obviously trying to be ranked probably differs in each of these types of firms. And at the same time, the role of young lawyers differs in these kinds of firms. So obviously it is difficult to design a strategy which fits for all, but what are the suggestions you can give to the audience today in case there's an interest to be ranked on how to behave within the firm and what they should do in order to convince the firm to invest in them and try to be ranked in obviously reputable legal directories?
Yeah, look, I think that it goes back to what I said at the start of the presentation in a sense that there is a benefit to the firm and to the practice group to getting more individuals ranked, right? So in Chambers particularly, but also in Legal 500 and other directories, the more individual rankings a practice group has, the better its chances of getting a better ranking as a practice group. And so that correlation is important, and it's something that I think young lawyers can use to their advantage. It's getting new individuals into the table is important for the firm's overall rankings. What's also true is that because of the kind of new dynamic of the directories and their kind of willingness to rank more younger lawyers, more diverse lawyers, it is often a bit easier to get into those kind of up-and-comer categories than it is for an older lawyer, a more established lawyer, to suddenly make the jump into the main bands. And so again, I think that's another key argument that you can make when you are trying to get involved in submissions. That kind of that's an easier win for your practice group sometimes than getting a more established lawyer into a table. And so I think that's a way of getting onto the submission. It's also the case, especially if you are maybe not a partner, but a young counsel or a senior associate, that you are not necessarily taking up space, taking somebody's slot on a submission, because you're not the sole lead on matters generally, and you're probably sharing your client referees with other partners. So it's not just a case of saying, okay, well, each lawyer we're putting forward is going to take up a certain amount of space. You are sharing that space with other lawyers on the submission, and it's about just making sure that your role on the matters is clearly described, and most importantly, that when your partner is reaching out to a client referee, they ensure that they give the referee an indication that speak about you as well as the partner themselves, right? So making sure that you are getting feedback specific to your role on the transaction or the matter that you handle for that client, as well as the partner. And so that's kind of part of the battle. But I think that's important to bear in mind. And the other thing is succession planning. I think getting younger lawyers on the submission is, even if they're not getting ranked in the first year, is really vital to the firm's to the sustainability of your firm's rankings, because at some point the senior, more established lawyers at the top of the table are going to retire, they're going to leave the firm, and for your firm's continued kind of high ranking chances, you need to have people coming in at the bottom of that table at a more junior level to take their places. And as I explained earlier, the directory ranking process is a cumulative one, and if you suddenly appear out of nowhere on a submission one year because suddenly there's some space for you, or the people or the practice group leader decide that there's some space for you, then you're not going to be ranked in that year. As it's going to take time, and your firm's ranking might potentially suffer in the meantime. If you've been appearing in that submission kind of consistently, if you've been getting some helpful client feedback, appearing on good deals in the past, you will already be on the radar of the directory. and it's more likely that you will be able to get ranked with one final push, and that's a massive benefit for the firm's ranking chances, because you keep up the overall number of individuals you've got ranked. You show that you've got young blood coming through the bottom. It's an important succession planning message that I think a lot of firms neglect because they focus too much on the kind of senior people at the top. It's really important that you find some space on the submissions, both for your own, but for your own sake, but also for the firm's ranking chances.
And in this respect, I think the Thomas Reber's question fits in. So obviously, if I'm a senior associate or an associate, I will tend to have peers who are at the same level of me. So associates or senior associates. So Thomas' question is whether it is, it is good to have also more junior peers as reference, or whether we should go only for partners, again, going back to those who we should indicate in our submission to be contacted.
Yeah. I mean, I think partners are going to carry more weight, frankly. And so I think if you're putting forward a peer as a reference, that peer should be a partner at a law firm. That's obviously not easy sometimes as an associate to get those sort of people on board, but that's the kind of peer feedback that's going to be noticed by the researcher.
Understood. Okay, so we got plenty of questions. Yeah, one question goes back actually to the beginning of of our webinar, which has to do with differences, the specific differences between legal 500 in chambers, whereby Eleni underlines that even if in the same countries there are firms which are ranked in chambers and legal 500 and get different rankings, despite, probably they prepare the same submissions for both of the directories. So this, I think, maybe this question maybe helps explain a little bit how they work and how they can differ in their approach.
Yeah, and that's a great question. And there are some really important differences between Chambers and Legal 500. They are, the two most prestigious directories, I think, and the two best research directories. The key difference between them is client referees. Chambers place much more emphasis on client referee feedback than Legal 500 does. Legal 500 is, happy to take a good submission at face value. Will make a judgment based on how you've presented yourself on that submission, how you've presented your deals, and will treat client feedback as a bit of a bonus. For Chambers, you can produce, the best submission that the researcher's ever seen, frankly. If you do not have some supportive client feedback to back that up, you're not going to get ranked. Mm-hmm. You can have a lawyer who's done, two of the biggest deals of the year. And, you kind of think, well, that speaks for itself, right? But ultimately, if you don't get client feedback to support that, you're not going to get ranked. And we see that, and that's the number one thing that we see time and time again when we start working with firms. They're kind of scratching their heads and they're saying, look, we've done all this great work, we've got all these great clients, putting that into our submissions, why aren't the directories, why isn't Chambers particularly recognizing that? And you find out that, 1 or 2 out of 20 of their clients have responded for the last 5 years. And it's just not enough to get ranked for Chambers. Whereas for Legal 500, it might be enough, actually. And so that tends to be the number one difference. Chambers is also more conservative than Legal 500 generally. It takes more time to get ranked in the first place in Chambers, and then it takes more time to actually rise up the bands in Chambers because they just have a more conservative approach. Legal 500, you see a lot more movement year on year.
And I pick one question again from Laura, which has to do again with the preparation of the submission. So whether do you believe that it is possible to highlight even smaller cases but more complex? So whether in the submission it is possible to highlight the complexity of the case rather than the size of the case. For instance, we got cases which are obviously big in terms of amount, but they're not very complex. And on the opposite, we got, I mean, small cases, but with a very high level of complexity.
Yeah.
Maybe the peers can, in that sense, help how in the submission we can direct the person who is, I mean, the surveyor to check, to contact the right person in order to highlight what are the peculiarities.
So the selection of your work highlights, and we're going to go on to talk about this a little bit in a minute, but the selection of your work highlights is obviously really important. And it really does depend a little bit on the practice area or the industry sector you're submitting for. For M&A, for capital markets, you know, for transactional practices in general, frankly, high dollar values, high monetary values are what is ultimately going to make the biggest difference to you. And those high value transactions should be first on the submission. That's not to say that you shouldn't focus on what makes those transactions interesting or significant or challenging or complex. You definitely should, because that's a key part of the evaluation criteria. But you know, the researchers are swayed by high value deals on those submissions. For other practice areas, you know, like litigation, for example, you know, like IP, like, you know, all sorts of kind of non-transactional areas, then you are looking much more at a balance between getting a matter on behalf of the high profile client on there and actually having something interesting to say about that matter. So you don't necessarily want to have 20 matters, you know, on behalf of the likes of Apple, Google, you know, all these sorts of brand name clients, if they are all day-to-day sort of, you know, advisory work, you know, not a huge amount of, but you don't have a huge amount to say about.
Mm-hmm.
You equally don't want, ideally, to have 20 matters for clients that nobody's heard of and are not, and we can't describe in an interesting way, even if those matters are really, really interesting. You ideally, the best submission, I think, has a mix of both. Shows that the firm or that you personally are acting for big name clients, but also shows that you are handling complex and sophisticated work. And there are all sorts of different ways that we can describe that complexity and that sophistication. And you know, part of preparing an effective submission is to be a little bit creative in terms of how we're actually describing this stuff, because ultimately the researcher is going to believe what we tell them on the page. And you know, we do need to sex up the descriptions sometimes to make them resonate. I think one of the key things to imagine is that you've got a researcher, they're on the receiving end of hundreds of these submissions, right? They have hundreds of these submissions to go through.
Yep.
Sometimes, you know, for each practice area they're kind of researching. A lot of this stuff is quite dry, and a lot of this stuff, you know, sounds pretty similar, right? Most firms of a certain level are doing similar types of work for similar types of clients. And so giving some color to the descriptions, helping them stand out in a concise and punchy way is part of the battle of getting the researcher's attention.
That's good. And with regards to activities which are cross-industry, as indicated by Susanna, is there any reason why we should not present the same activity, both, for instance, in a banking and finance submission as well as in an M&A one? Or
that's fine. Yeah, I mean, if the same matter is genuinely relevant for two submissions, or even more than two submissions, it can be used. You know, prime examples of that are, M&A for a technology company, for example.
Yeah.
That's obviously that should go in the M&A submission. That should go in your TMT submission. That's the kind of that's kind of no-brainer. That's absolutely fine. Where you need to be careful is with client referees, because and this is very specific to chambers, but for chambers, they will only contact a client once during a 3-month period. So if your M&A submission is due in February, and you put that client referee for that M&A deal on that submission, they will be contacted for that M&A submission, but then they will not be contacted again for the TMT submission, which is due in May, for example, because of that 3-month rule. And so you just need to prioritize where you want that client to be contacted in the cycle, and make sure, ideally, that you get them contacted first, the first deadlines.
And last question, which I see, is one from Anna, and has to do more with firm more in general, which is one topic actually today we didn't have time to speak about thoroughly, but it is certainly interesting also the more general approach of firms rather than of individuals in the firm to these submissions. But Anna's question concerned with diversity and inclusion and ESG, so environmental, social, and governance initiatives, and whether they will be a category to rank firms in the near future, in your opinion, or you believe that this will not be the case?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I actually do know, because we've been working with some firms actually to lobby chambers on this very specific point about ranking firms at ESG. We do know that they are actually going to be coming out with a ranking this year on ESG specifically. We think that at first it's going to be quite a sort of regional ranking, so either Europe wide or global wide, and so by definition it will at least initially focus on very large firms, international firms. But the intention, I believe the intention is to expand that into specific jurisdictions and look to include, more firms, including local firms in their own jurisdictions in ranking tables. So yeah, that is definitely happening behind the scenes at chambers. They haven't invited submissions to that process yet. They are just doing their own research into it at the moment. But I think going forward, they're going to be starting to invite firms to submit for that category specifically.
Okay. And then, okay, we got 10 minutes left. So if you have questions, or Daniel, if you have any arguments which you believe it is important to treat in these 10 minutes, please let me know. Otherwise, I will go on with the next question from Susanna.
No, go ahead. Yeah, no, these are great questions. So let's keep coming.
Okay. So, and this is a very good one, actually, because, we talked about many peers, referees, and so on, but it is true that many times in obviously not only M&A, but also in other industries, it happens to work with advisors. So either financial advisors, as Susanna indicated, big fours, or financial consultancy companies, or for instance, if I think about environmental consultancy companies. So what's the role of these other advisors in these submissions? Are they useful? It is useful to involve them in your experience. Are they contacted? Is their opinion high regarded or not?
So yes, that's a great question for M&A specifically. Financial advisors. So the two things on the submissions themselves, on the deals themselves, you get most credit for working for the principal parties on the deal, so the buyer or the seller side. You get less credit for deals where you act for the financial advisor. And so that's a consideration when you're actually selecting the deals in the first place. In terms of how they function as client referees, I actually think it's it can be reversed. I think that financial advisors can actually make really great referees because they tend to have experience of using multiple law firms and multiple lawyers. And so they are able to give the sort of comparative feedback that's going to get you on the map. And so I actually think that, you know, putting them forward can be very helpful. And that kind of goes to a broader point that you don't necessarily have to, there doesn't necessarily have to be a link between the deals on your submission and the client referees on your referee list. You don't have to have a deal for every client referee or a client referee for every deal. The only non-negotiable for client referees is that you've worked with them in the past 12 months in that practice area or industry sector that's the subject of the submission. So yeah, you know, financial advisors, you know, for an M&A practice, financial advisors can be really helpful, helpful referees. Other third-party professionals in other practice areas, you know, like accountants, for example, or auditors, for example, or, you know, arbitrators, for example, you know, all sorts of different third parties can actually function as really helpful referees depending on which practice area you're submitting for, because they can give that kind of comparative feedback of the market, which again, especially for younger lawyers, especially for people trying to get into the table for the first time, puts you on the map.
And we have, I think, time for a couple of more questions. I will pick the last one from Anna, as it relates to the question posed by the other Anna before. And it's how important is the section on diversity and inclusion? So whether if we put information in the firm regarding, again, women who are partners, and again, more in general, the importance of diversity for the firm can increase the chances to be ranked, or this is just, let me say, information about the firm, but it will not help our submission.
So the general kind of diversity and inclusion statistics at the top of the Chambers form, for example, are where you talk about the percentages of female lawyers in your practice, the percentages of ethnically diverse lawyers in your practice, et cetera, those are not going to make any difference whatsoever to your firm's ranking chances. They are there for Chambers' own kind of research purposes so that they can benchmark their rankings against what is happening in diversity more generally. So we work with many firms that leave those sections blank, frankly, or make them confidential because they're not comfortable giving that much specific information about the practice area. Other firms do include it, but it's really only for Chambers research purposes. The diversity question more broadly, though, is a really important strategic consideration because, as I mentioned earlier, we are seeing, you know, the directories have been criticized a lot, and I think quite rightly in a lot of cases, for a lack of diversity recently, and they are definitely very keen to be seen to be proactively dealing with that. And so you're seeing more female lawyers being ranked, you're seeing more ethnically diverse lawyers being ranked, and that's, I think, an opportunity for diverse lawyers to actually get ranked in the table. And that extends to kind of younger lawyers generally as well. You know, the directories are keen to rank a lot more younger lawyers these days. And so I think that, you know, while those headline statistics will not make any difference to the firm's ranking chances, a strategy that has diversity in mind when you're talking about who your individual ranking chances are, who individual ranking priorities are, makes sense because it makes those people more likely to be ranked. And as I've said before, the correlation between individual rankings and the firm ranking ultimately helps the firm's ranking at the end of the day too.
Okay. So let's see. Well, we got one question, which is the difference between Chambers Europe and Chambers Global.
Yeah, that's a good question, and the answer to that has changed a lot over time, and I'm not sure that, you know, Chambers has quite worked out what the difference is between those two directories in some cases. The theory is that So obviously Chambers Global ranks every firm in the firms in every jurisdiction of the world, but in Europe specifically, it is supposed to rank a limited number of practice areas. So it will only rank, say, banking and finance, corporate M&A, dispute resolution, I think IP as well, and possibly tax, depending on the jurisdiction. So it ranks a more limited number of practice areas, and the theory is that it focuses on firms that have international cross-border practices in those practice areas. So it's not looking at firms that just have a predominantly domestic focus. It looks at firms that are doing cross-border work. They don't have to be international firms. They can be local independent firms that do cross-border work for international clients, but they need to be doing cross-border work for international clients.
Okay.
It also ranks a more limited number of kind of lawyers generally as well for that reason.
Okay. And now I have a question for Oreste. Since we got 3 minutes left, I think I have to reach the conclusion because I see that other questions are popping up and I find them all interesting. So Oreste, let me know if we have time or if I should make the final remarks. Okay, I see no reply, but given that
I'm very happy to answer more questions if you want to go on further. If people want to email me as well, then very happy to respond to anything by email as a follow-up too.
Okay, we got 10 more minutes. That's very useful because I see Lars' question, which again, it can be pretty relevant for us, for AIJA members, which is how the involvement in professional international associations can benefit the submissions. Obviously, not only international, but also at local level. So we think about bar associations, for instance, AIJA, the International Bar Associations, or IPBA, or any other international association. Is this activity regarded as relevant by those evaluating the submissions, or it is only a network which can bring its peers, but it is not directly relevant for the submission itself?
I think it's the latter. I think it's less about what just putting that on the submission does to you. I don't think that the fact that you are a member of a bar association is going to move the needle for you. If through that you've done lots of thought leadership, you participated in in seminars, you've produced kind of papers, things like that, publications, then as a young lawyer that starts to speak to your activity, to your thought leadership, to your level of authority in the practice area and sector that you're submitting for. So there is some benefit if you can point to a few examples of that. But the biggest benefit, as you say, and as I said earlier, is the networking opportunities that getting involved in those associations provides, and how that leads to peer feedback at the end of the day.
Okay, then I see that we reply. I think that we replied to Thierry's question regarding confidential versus publishable. While I would pick Thomas' questions regarding what encourages the publication to open a new area research in the jurisdiction, because the example made by Thomas is, for instance, in life sciences, there's no focus in small jurisdictions. So how, reasonings behind opening submission on a specific practice work in this kind of.
Yeah, so that's a good question. I mean, we've had quite a lot of success in kind of lobbying the directories to introduce new practice areas, new industry sectors to their coverage. And I think where we've had success is when we've been able to demonstrate that, look, we're obviously acting on behalf of a law firm, our client, but we're able to demonstrate that, look, this isn't just a self-interested kind of pitch because our client is going to rank highly in this section. It's actually a legitimate sort of slice of the market in its own right, and you need to demonstrate, basically, to a directory that ranking table, say for life sciences, is going to look significantly different to the existing ranking table that they have for, say, IP, for example. If they're going to rank the same firms and the same individuals for life sciences and IP, because basically people do both, that's the directories won't see the benefit of introducing that table. If we can say to them, hey, look, this is what we think the table might look like. We think that we should be band 1, but we also think in fairness that these other firms should be included. We also think that in fairness, these other individual lawyers should be included. And that table is going to look significantly different to tables that you already have in your directory. That's where they start listening, because they like ranking new firms, they like ranking new lawyers, and they like representing the market in a way that makes sense in that local jurisdiction. So that's a way to approach it, and that's where we've had success in getting ranking tables introduced.
Okay, so thank you very much, Daniel. I mean, in my opinion, it's been super useful. Obviously, there's a lot of discussion going on about directories, prices, awards, and so on. Also, under the ontological point of view, at national level, there's a lot of discussion in some countries going on, but certainly with regards to more reputable ones, it is an interesting marketing tool, and it might be an interesting marketing tool, especially for young lawyers. So it is definitely something that is worth investigating. It is worth discussing. Probably with the SCILL team, we will try to propose other activities with regards to this topic. We were very happy to see that at some point we touched 80 participants. That for a webinar in the middle of the week, it's fantastic. Probably also thanks to Daniel's expertise on this. I thank you very much to the whole AIJA team, which has been super helpful for the organization of the webinar, and obviously to Francois and all the other AIJA officers, and especially to my co-officers, Max, Frederica, but also Elisa and Francesca, because obviously working in this period has been super difficult. Not seeing each other, it's even worse. But at some point, hopefully, we will again be able to meet in person, and that's the hope we share with all of you. And thank you again, Daniel, and to all the attendees, and hope to see you very soon.